Welcome to the weekly wine webinar on Chablis, you guys. So I have the lovely, lovely Demacy 2014 Chablis Premier Cru. I'm very excited to be drinking that. I hope you guys all have some fun stuff. Go ahead and share if you'd like on your video. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in, you guys, because why not? Lovely. That looks amazing. Okay, all right, you guys. I'm so excited about this because I absolutely love Chablis, and I'm so excited to be doing the wine webinar on Chablis. I don't know who else here loves Chablis, but it is delicious to drink and really, really exciting. So I will go ahead and get started with our lovely, lovely chat and presentation. So I am, I mean, the thing about Chablis is that it's funny when I mention Chablis, and whenever we teach the classes on Chablis and Chardonnay, people often get confused because they don't realize it means the same thing. But Chablis itself is such a specific little region, and it is so specific to the type of wine that you're drinking that if you love it, you know you love it, and you definitely cannot miss it. So it's really exciting to be able to have that kind of specificity, which is kind of what makes it so very, very exciting. So when we talk about Chablis, of course, we're talking about the one of the northernmost region of Burgundy itself. And so it's in France. It is a French wine region. And it does specifically focus on the Chardonnay grape, which we'll talk about too. But here's where it gets confusing a little bit, because Chablis is also the name of the main city, the main village that is part of the region in Burgundy. It's also the name of the Grand Cru AOC and the other AOCs. So it's a little special when you get into French kind of AOC nomenclature. Chablis has a little bit of a uniqueness about itself with that. But so it can get confusing when you say Chablis, you know, I mean, it's not really, as long as you're drinking it, that's all that matters. But it is a dry white wine. Pretty consistently, it's going to be dry. You're never going to end up with sweet Chablis. They don't make any sort of demi-sec or anything like that. It's dry, it's delightful. It also has the unfortunate history of being synonymous, especially in the United States, with just cheap white wine. Because at some point someone thought it was a really great idea to just go ahead and take that name and go ahead and use it to just reference basic white wines in the United States. And I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. Has everyone seen those big jugs of like Carlo Rossi Chablis on there? It's not the same wine at all. And that happens sometimes where people get very confused and they're like, oh, Chablis. Or, in a earlier time, people would just go in and they'd order, a Chablis or a Chablis, and then, move on from there thinking they're just getting whatever white wine. So it does have that sort of borrowed nomenclature that makes it kind of confusing at times. But here's the really exciting part about Chablis. So Chablis is part of Burgundy and, of course, part of France, French wine regions and all wine regions, really. You're looking at a place that was established originally by the Romans. The Romans came and pretty much brought viticulture everywhere into Europe, including France, Spain, obviously coming from Italy, Germany as well. But here is where, so that was back in, pre-BC, so about 300 BC to all the way about 400 AD or so, that you have the Romans really kind of establishing viticulture as a general rule throughout Europe. But for Chablis in particular, and a lot of France, the Cistercian monks were really kind of in the Middle Ages is when you start to see that kind of honing in and focus on viticulture as a quality kind of economic feature of the rural areas. So it was actually the monks of Pontigny in 1114 AD, of course, that started the plantings, the first plantings, and most like of Chablis, of Chardonnay, I should say, in the Chablis region, which when we see on the map, you'll see is pretty far away from the rest of Burgundy when we talk about it. So in the 19th century, this particular area was really flourishing in terms of wine production, as was much of Burgundy. But Chablis, because of its specific location, much closer to Paris, had the advantage of proximity. So for that early time period, you had a lot of people. Got it. You have a lot of people that were able to access Chablis wines and wines from that region more easily in Paris, in the capital, and they were thirsty people. So, it hasn't changed much. But what did end up changing was that the country as a whole, and Chablis in particular, got hit pretty hard in the mid to late 1800s with a few different things that really diminished production, quality, and not quality, but actually quantity. The first, of course, was disease. So powdery mildew is a very, very prevalent disease when it comes to vineyards and viticulture. It does have a cure, but it was something that still devastated a lot of vineyards in Chablis in the late 1800s, around 1886. So you see this sort of loss of vineyard area because of the powdery mildew. And then the year after that, in 1867, suddenly you get hit with phylloxera, that nasty little bug that just starts to kill off everything. If you were here at the earlier stages of the webinars, you saw a whole big old process on what phylloxera is and how much it really devastated those vineyards. But after that, it was interesting because what really damaged Chablis' ability to produce wine and actually export it was the fact that there was a railway that was put in the 1850s. And so before that, there was no high-speed or any kind of like public or mass transportation that would allow the transportation of goods from southern France to Paris. So suddenly here you are in 1856, this huge revolutionary railway that basically connected Paris through Lyon to Marseille, all the way across the country. And this hurt Chablis dramatically because suddenly these lesser expensive wines that were coming from the south of France that were available suddenly in Paris very easily and very affordably, more affordably than the Chablis wines, actually caused a lot of harm to the industry of Chablis in general. And because so much vineyard had been lost, vineyard area had been lost in the late 1800s because of powdery mildew and because of phylloxera, a lot of producers decided that they did not want to replant. They didn't find it economically viable to continue production. So you have an area that was probably one of the largest planted areas, the greater Yonne area, which is one of the rivers that is up there in the Auxerrois, from 40,000 hectares of vines all the way down to about 500 when we're talking about early 19th century, like hitting that's how low planting was in Chablis. There was not a lot of anything happening. There's a couple of other reasons as well, because it's very difficult to grow there. When we talk about the climate, we'll understand why. It has a lot to do with frost. But the reality was that kind of mid 19th century, around the 1960s, there were revolutions in the ability for them to protect their vineyards against frost that allowed them to have more confidence in replanting. And from the 1960s on, you saw a huge, huge increase in vineyard area and production, and all the way through today, because obviously Chablis is one of the most recognized and one of the most uniquely specific wines in the wine world, and very, very, very rightly so. So when we talk about the location of Chablis, again, we're in northern France, northeastern France, we're south of Paris, and we're also north of most of Burgundy. So the Chablis vineyards, the sort of small area of Chablis and the Auxerrois, is north of Beaune by about 62 miles. And there are hills that separate it, and it's a lot of distance considering that Burgundy itself is really not that big. So what does that mean? It means that the wines that come out of Chablis are very different from the ones that come out of the rest of Burgundy. This has to do with the more northern latitude that they're at, right? Which results in kind of a semi-continental climate, a little bit more influence from the Atlantic Ocean they're actually getting, and which also brings a lot of weather in there. So the ocean is sort of maritime influence, if you will, is very, very notorious for bringing rain and clouds and just sort of lots of unappealing weather that can do things like blot out your sunlight, which is bad for vineyards, right? We all know that we need that sun in order to ripen those grapes. It causes a lower temperature overall, especially when you have kind of you're further north. Realistically, your temperatures are going to be lower anyway, which is actually great for the vines in the sense that it helps to elongate that growing season. And so by elongating the growing season, I know you've heard me say this before, but it gives that grape and those vines the ability to ripen slowly, which helps to also retain acidity, a very, very important hallmark of Chablis wines. And it also helps to add more complexity to the actual development of aromas and flavors that you're getting in the grape itself. But the downside of that, of course, is the fact that with that weather comes things like vintage variation. And we hear about that, especially Bordeaux, for example, a maritime climate, vintage variation. What does that mean? It means that every year is going to be different. because you cannot predict the weather from year to year. It changes so rapidly and it can be so devastating as well. Chablis has a hard time, man. It's like they oftentimes lose so much of their harvest from the beginning of the year before it can even turn into grapes from frosts. Spring frosts are one of the most devastating things that happen to Chablis, and they happen often. Actually, just before that sort of resurgence in the 1960s, you see that the Chablis vineyards just went through like a decade of terrible, terrible frosts. And what frosts do is basically they attack the grapes in the spring. They can happen in Chablis as late as May. So in theoretically, Chablis could be getting frosts right now, which is insane considering that you have really, really your grapes start to develop in March, or the vines themselves, the blossoms start to come on, and you have flowering and all of that. So the frosts, when they hit before at any point, they can actually reduce your crop by almost half, depending on how bad it is. And without protection against that, which is what happened in Chablis, obviously prior to the 1960s, with the limited ability to protect against that frost, it was a gamble year to year about whether or not you were going to have enough to make a viable harvest to even make enough production. So the loss of fruit from weather damage can significantly affect the amount of wine that is produced from the region. This is also one of those things that can lead to Chablis wines and Burgundy wines in general for being a little bit more expensive, although there's a lot of other factors that go into that as well. But the fewer grapes you're able to actually harvest, the less wine you can make, the more expensive you end up with that. So the other thing about the location of Chablis, of course, we are talking north and we're along the Seine River. The Seine River goes into the Yonne River, which is slightly bigger and just a little bit further to the west in that Auxerrois region. And if you look on the map there, you can kind of see that. This is a really good example, though, of where you have vineyards that are pretty much exclusively planted on hillsides. All of your best vineyards in Chablis are going to be planted on sort of the south and southwest facing hillsides along the banks of the river, because that's where you're getting your aspect. You're getting that tilt of the earth that allows you to get more sunlight, to allow for more ripening of the grapes, which is really, really important in a cooler region like Chablis. So as the region spreads out, you have your best vineyards on those hills. As they start to get flatter, that's where when we talk about the different categories of Chablis, you're getting into your Petit Chablis, where they're planted on flatter land, which doesn't necessarily result in quite as much excitement, if you will, in your resulting wines. So what really, really makes Chablis just sing and just the most exciting thing about it really is the soil. And so whenever we're talking about Burgundy, whenever we're talking about French wines in general, but very specifically Burgundy, they are all about terroir. And they have made a science of it, defining their soils and identifying their wines based on those particular plots of land that those grapes are grown on. And the age of those soils is part of what makes it so important. So this is one of the most fun things that I ever learned about wine. Chablis is in part of what's called the Paris Basin. So eons and eons and eons ago, basically, the entire central France used to be covered in a shallow sea. Right? And for millions and millions of years. So the soils of Chablis actually date back to the Upper Jurassic Age, which is about 180 million years ago. But what had happened was that this underwater sea, and the temperature was subtropical. So, imagine bananas growing in Chablis now. But we've got basically this shallow sea, and over millions and millions of years within each epoch, basically there were different kinds of sea critters, particularly shellfish and crustaceans and things like that. And so as these individual little creatures would die and fall to the bottom of the shallow sea, over time they would get compressed, and they basically form limestone and limestone marls, which is a clay. It's basically limestone and clay mixed together. And then each of these soils, so each of these layers, if you will, are named after the dominant sea creature of that time. And so over time, you have these layers that basically are creating plates, stacking on top of one another. When we talk about this over, again, millions and millions and millions of years. And so this is the basis of the soils in Burgundy and in this part of France where the Paris Basin is. So over time, the sea retracted and it got pulled back north. So the basin went all the way down to Beaujolais. So in all the way in the south of Burgundy, where Beaujolais is, where you have those granite soils that make up the Crus of Beaujolais, that is basically the oldest soils of this Paris basin, right? So that granite massif, it comes up in Beaujolais. And then as the sea receded over millions and millions of years, the soils essentially that we have are younger. So actually, Chablis has some of the youngest soils in France and in the Paris Basin, which are roughly between 140 and 160 years old, right? So million years old, I should say. So that's a pretty interesting thing to think about in terms of the soils of the old world. When we talk about the old world, how ancient these soils are and what they're made of. So this eventually became a plain, and at some point, of course, the Alps were formed due to seismic activity. And as the Alps were formed, the Paris Basin, all of these plates that are stacked on top of one another, right? They kind of like surged upward into a souffle, and then basically imagine a souffle just like popping and crumbling, and all of those plates got dropped. And that basically shattered all of the plates, mixed them all up, and these are the soils of Burgundy. So this is partially why Burgundy everywhere, not just in Chablis, you have such a diverse soil material from vineyard to vineyard, because of this crazy, crazy mix-up of the soils as this, what it's called a graben, this basically deflated souffle, was created as the Alps were formed. And also the as this graben was created, you have two sides of it. One is the Côte d'Or, the hills of the Côte d'Or, and the other is the Jura Mountains, the Jura Hills as well. And then right in the middle, you have the Seine River that comes down, which did not create this sort of narrow gorge. It just simply collects there. So this is the same river that far north of Burgundy itself, of Beaune, for example, we have Chablis that's sitting on those vineyards. So the two most important soils in Chablis are Kimmeridgian marl. Again, when we were talking about that, we're looking at a picture of it right now. So these are these little comma-shaped, basically, crustaceans that lived during the Kimmeridgian era, which was approximately 160 million years ago. And so you find, if you ever go to Chablis, I don't know how many people have been to Chablis, but if you go to Chablis, you essentially have, specifically in the Grand Cru vineyards, which is all Kimmeridgian marl, you can easily find these fossilized sea creatures in the soils. They're everywhere. It's really, really cool. And you can kind of see there's just like these shells and fossils that make up the minerality and the sort of specificity of this particular area. And now these Kimmeridgian marls are limestone. They tend to be lighter in color, almost white. And this same soil actually resurfaces. It goes under the Atlantic Ocean and resurfaces up in the White Cliffs of Dover. So these are the same soils that you'll find there, which is really fascinating. So the other important part of the other most important soil, of course, the Kimmeridgians are considered, the Kimmeridgian marl is considered the premier soil of Chablis. And it is just known for creating this racy tension that we kind of identify with Chablis. It has sort of this exotic minerality, this incredible sort of tensile, like racy edge to it. And that's attributed to specifically this Kimmeridgian marl. So you will find Kimmeridgian marl in the soils of the Grand Cru Chablis and in the Premier Cru Chablis. Those are all the vineyards that are planted on the best soils. So then we have just considered lesser in quality is the Portlandian marl. And this is where you'll find with your regular, just straight up Chablis, and we'll talk about that in the organization of the AOC. But the Portlandian marl is a little bit younger. It's not considered quite as apt at creating that really, really racy tension that we appreciate the most. It tends for just sort of lots of acidity, which is important in Chablis and great for the wines, but a little less sort of specific, a little less chiseled, if you will, in terms of a flavor profile. And these are what you find, the Portlandian marl is what you find in Chablis AOC and in Petit Chablis AOC, which is also kind of where it spreads out into the plains, more so away from the hills. So this is what I was talking about when we're talking about the actual Chablis AOCs. So Chablis is part of Burgundy, so it means that it follows that same organization system in terms of Grand Cru being its own AOC. and being at the very top of the quality pyramid. So your Grand Cru Chablis exists. There is one single vineyard that is Grand Cru in Chablis. Now, this is, of course, it is the perfect aspect facing on the southwest facing slopes of the Seine River. And this is all Camargue Marl. But the actual single vineyard of the Grand Cru Chablis is broken up into 7 different climats, which are essentially named zones within that particular area. So you have, that means, and you have, again, just like in all of Burgundy, you have a lot of fractured ownership. So that means that there's a lot of producers that own part of Grand Cru vineyards, for example. But you have this, by all intents and purposes, creating your highest quality with the most purest Chablis flavor, that really, really incredible tension, electricity in your mouth that is just remarkable and really cannot be reproduced anywhere else. So below that, right below that, you have Chablis Premier Cru. And just as we talked about with what following the AOC pyramid in Burgundy, Premier Cru is not its own AOC. So Grand Crus in Burgundy are always their own AOC. That means if you look on the bottle, it's going to say Grand Cru, Chablis Grand Cru AOC, instead of, for example, saying Chablis AOC, Grand Cru Vineyard, blah, blah, blah. So Premier Crus are actually part of what we call the village level. And the village level is also happens to be Chablis. As we talked about, it can get a little confusing. So there's Chablis Grand Cru, then there's Chablis AOC, which is the village level. And then you have Premier Cru vineyards that fall within the Chablis AOC category. And these are still considered higher quality than your just general AOC. So you have in Chablis about 40 individual Premier Cru vineyards. And then within those vineyards, you have what are called, again, sort of climats or ludis, named parcels within those vineyards that can identify different quality or just sort of different, not even quality, but just different characteristics within that single vineyard. Because as we mentioned, with so much of that soil being moved around and different and just very, very diverse, you're going to get a different expression of Chardonnay based on where you plant it, even if you're planting within the same Premier Cru vineyard. So including all of these different little ludis that exist within the Premier Cru vineyards, you're looking at about 80 different expressions of Premier Cru Chablis, which will all fall into the Chablis AOC. But I mean, I just want to point out too, like when you're looking at this, so on the Demacy Chablis Premier Cru here, it will say what the vineyard is. So mine, for example, says Vaillant. And Vaillant is one of the 40 main Premier Cru vineyards. But within those, there are also, Vaillant has, for example, 4 or 5 different named places within it that can also be used on the label. So that can get a little confusing because you might not know just based on that which Premier Cru vineyard it's from. But as long as it says Premier Cru, you know that it's from that Camargue Marl. It's going to be going to give you that same sort of characteristic tension and electricity. Not quite what you're going to get from a Grand Cru, of course, but you know, still really, really exciting to drink if that's what you like. So underneath that, we have our general Chablis AOC. And so if you remember way back when I was talking about that kind of expansion and growth in the late 20th century of Chablis, this is the AOC that sort of got the brunt of that. So we had a lot of expanding vineyard area being planted, and the majority of that, just simply because of real estate, went into Chablis AOC. So this is a category that can be a little bit dicey. If you just have a Chablis AOC, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I will take a Chablis AOC or a Petit Chablis AOC over a lot of other Chardonnays, hands down, no problem. But when we're talking about within the hierarchy of Chablis, Chablis AOC can vary quite a bit in terms of expectation of quality, if you will. And again, I hate saying quality because I really do believe very strongly that all Chablis is high quality. It's all AOC wine. It's all going to do a very, very good job. But giving that purest expression of what Chablis should represent, Chablis AOC is where you'll find the most variance on that expression. And then finally, Petit Chablis AOC, it's considered kind of like the lowest rung on the ladder for Chablis in general, which is still going to be good. And this is again where we started to expand that vineyard area outside of everything that was already named Chablis AOC. So it's the youngest AOC in Chablis. It tends to just be a little less structured, a little less refined and elegant, and it is all planted on that Portlandian marl, which doesn't give quite that same kind of edge and racy acidity, but still gives good acidity and still makes great wine. So finally, when enjoying Chablis, which I certainly hope everyone is right now, I'm going to. So there's a couple things you want to remember about the very lovely, lovely wine that we are drinking. So one thing that is always really important that I like to remind people of, you don't want to drink this too cold. It's actually true of all Chardonnays. Chardonnay is a grape varietal that doesn't tend to be overly aromatic. So but it tends to have body, and when it has structure and acidity, it tastes better and you get more of the aroma experience if it's at a slightly warmer temperature. So this means that basically you're using it kind of almost at cellar temperature, which is about 55 degrees, as opposed to like a 45 degree or even 50 degree that you'd serve like a much more aromatic varietal at, or something that you want to kind of pump up the acidity on, or sort of highlight that more. Because one thing too is that Chablis, as a Chardonnay, is going to naturally have a lot of natural acidity to it. And I realized I skipped over this earlier, but the other thing to note about Chablis, it's always 100% Chardonnay. So Chablis is synonymous with Chardonnay. And when the winemakers are making it, they have a choice. They sometimes use only stainless steel. And this is a way to, again, highlight the purest character of the fruit that you're getting from Chablis. And that is where you're going to get sort of the most clean, crisp, like acid-driven kind of Chablis out there. And this is very much a stylistic choice of the winemaker. And much of Chablis is done entirely in stainless steel with no oak whatsoever. However, there is, of course, definitely a faction of producers that still use some oak. And when I say the use of oak, I do want to specify that I'm not talking about new French oak. You will not tend to find a lot of new French oak, or almost any new French oak, in Chablis at all. What they're using, generally speaking, is that older oak. So you have people like William Febvre that have sister wineries down in Beaune, for example, that are making Chardonnay down in Beaune. Other white Burgundies where they do use a fraction of new French oak. And so they will take their old barrels, basically, and use them, bring them up to Chablis, and they'll use those barrels for maybe some fermentation and then put the rest of it to age into stainless steel. Or they might do a stainless steel fermentation and then use that older oak to just add a little bit of complexity, to allow a little bit of that oxygen to pass into the wine and kind of give it that textural quality that you can get from a slight bit of neutral oak exposure. And they might just blend the two. It really depends. But what you're going to get always with Chablis, which is partially why I love it and why it has such a namesake, is that that beautiful minerality. So there's always going to be kind of a tingle on your tongue. There's going to be great fruit. You should get that yellow apple and lemon zest out of it. So as we're smelling it and tasting it, but there's also kind of like a creme fraiche, which will come from a little bit of the malolactic fermentation, and a little bit of that lees contact. A lot of times, the producers will also leave the wines in contact with lees, those dead yeast cells, to allow a little bit more complexity to develop in the wine itself. So what this brings me to is that if you drink it too cold, you're going to miss a lot of that. And it's going to be a really, really disappointing experience, because it will be so much better if you give it a little bit of time. And it's actually really nice, because if you're enjoying a good dinner, you can open a bottle of Chablis at the beginning of dinner. It can sit on the table. You don't have to put it in an ice bucket. You can go ahead and just allow it to sort of come to room temp even, and it will still be very, very enjoyable. But and speaking of dinner, I mean, what are we eating when we're having this gorgeous wine? Oftentimes we're doing things like, and I see someone asking right now, what summer foods pair best with Chablis? You're gonna want things like, it's actually considered a perfect oyster wine, because you have a lot of those crustaceans and those Kimmeridgian the fossils that come out of the soil, and you have definitely these beautiful comparisons when you have oysters or shellfish or any of those beautiful things. Yes, things that are tangy, things like goat cheese and smoked trout. I see someone saying that too, which is beautiful. And then you have just your seafood in general, but also what's wonderful about the Chablis is because they have such high acidity in them, this natural acidity that can cut through a lot of stuff. They're also a perfect combination for things like beurre blanc sauces. So anything that has butter on it, lobster and butter with Chablis, I mean, just go ahead and like, yes, crab cakes, any kind of shellfish, which are some of my favorite things to eat. It's super important. And so know that you have a lot of flexibility with Chablis because it's a little bit fuller bodied, but has beautiful acidity. And so it can pair with a lot of things. And then you have your vintages. So like anything, if it's a vintage variation, that you want to be knowledgeable about your white Burgundies and your Burgundies in general. You want to know kind of what the vintages are going to be best and where it's showing the most ideal expression of your grape. And so, for example, you've got 2014 is considered the most recent year that has been absolutely the best for Chablis in quite some time. So by like far and away, like if you find a 2014 Chablis, if you find a 2014 Grand Cru Chablis, I had one that I opened up last week, and it blows your mind. It's the most amazing thing you put in your mouth. It's so good. It's also kind of hard to find now, so sorry about that. But if you find it, just get it. It's totally worth it. And we've got, oh, I have a hand raised. Yes, Bill. Hold on, let me find you over here. The other thing is that, so 2010 and 2005 and 2002 were also great years, great vintages to find. The thing about Burgundy, of course, is that you are allowed to age them, and most of the Premier Crus and Grand Crus especially will take sometimes 10 to 15 years actually to peak. So you have a long time you can hold on to these guys too. Yes, everybody. Okay, so Bill, go ahead and ask the question that you wanted to ask. Or did I miss it? Okay, I might have missed it. Oh, I have a message. Anyway, so, and yes, Trader Joe's does have some as well. It's easier to find Chablis than it used to be. So I definitely recommend finding it, drinking it, and enjoying it. All right, my friends, and that is that. I want to thank you so much for coming. And does it pair with any desserts? It can, but you don't want anything too sweet. You'll kind of lose the beauty of the wine with dessert. So like stone fruits or something like that, and maybe a little bit of a creme fraiche, less sweet. You'll be pretty good on that too. So that's it, you guys. This is Chablis, and actually, I think I came in about like the normal time today. So. Cheers to everyone. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free, write it in the chat box, ask me whatever else you want. I'm gonna drink this while someone asks me something, or not. I do want to thank you all very much for coming again. So sign you all off. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful week. For those of you who are in my last Italy class tomorrow, I will see you tomorrow. And then this week, I should be able to get out. We will be doing the Loire. Loire is happening next month. There will be a 4-part class on Loire Valley. I've just finalized all the wines. I know, I'm excited. So it should be, all the wines will be from High Time. And you'll be able to get the full case there or individuals as it goes through. So it was good. It was good to be able to get that together. I'm just waiting on them to get me some links. So then it'll be out, and I'll be excited to see you all there. Yeah, yes. Excellent. Well, okay, you guys. Cheers.
Right.
You guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.